I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Once again, we've made it through Lent, and we're just about to Easter. Can't wait. It's coming so soon. I know everyone's really excited for it. If you've never been to Easter before, this time you're going to love it.
Don't ask too many questions about the origins of these eggs, and you'll be fine.
That's true. It's not important where they came from. Just stick them in your gob. That means, though, we've got to talk about resurrection. So when it comes to our podcast, we talk a lot about the other side of things, the crucifixion. Not just the crucifixion of Jesus, but the crucified people. Those people that the Spanish Salvadoran Jesuit theologian Ignacio of Loyola has recognized as being of the same class of people as Jesus, who our economic system always seems to crucify for some reason, because it hates poor people. Anyways, you can learn more about Ignacio of Loyola and the crucified people in a previous episode that I'll try to link somewhere. But anyways, crucifixion makes a lot of sense for people on the left to talk about because there's so many people who continue to be crucified just like daily, right? Class war, that's it. That's what's happening. So it kind of fits together, I think, with the leftist framework. But since it's Easter, we have to think a little bit harder about the other side of the equation. We have to think about resurrection and what that might mean in terms of politics and in terms of liberation. Liberation theologians have said a lot of interesting things about resurrection, especially with regard to politics. But here's a particularly wild take from an interesting liberation theologian that you probably haven't heard of. A little bit off the beaten track. When it comes to politics, humans trend toward a type of utopian thinking. Utopian thinking is, despite what some people might tell you, usually good when put into practice and can generate, hope. Christians, however, are particularly good at thinking this way because our hope is rooted in a battle that's already been won by the resurrection of Jesus. A lot of things have been going on there, a lot of moving parts. But this take comes from Brazilian theologian João Batista Libânio in an essay that he wrote called Hope, Utopia, and Resurrection. In the essay, he unpacks what utopia and hope mean theologically speaking. In this episode, we're going to see how we feel about it. Dean and I, we came in hot talking about this. We said we liked it. And then after we said we liked the essay, we did unpack all the things we didn't like about it. So we'll see how the whole conversation goes. But regardless, I think that there's an interesting argument in this essay that makes you think about resurrection and politics in this sort of different way than maybe other Christians and liberation theologians do. So even if we end up not liking it or we find things not to like in it, I think there's something pretty productive in reading it. So I don't know, Dean, what do you think? What should we do? What should we talk about?
Well, we can talk about Libânio in just a second. I feel like also just in the context of this podcast, it's worth highlighting that we don't really talk about the resurrection much for probably lots of reasons. I mean, like you said, Matt, already, it's easier to talk about the crucifixion side of things if you have a left-leaning vocabulary or training or whatever. But I think also, we say a lot on the show that we're reticent to talk about theology. I don't think Matt or I consider ourselves theologians. We try to be theologically literate. We read theologians. We have thoughts about theologians, but neither of us have done theology per se as a professional discipline. And I think also I don't know about you, Matt, but for me, I feel like whenever I talk about Christian doctrine, I encounter people who have really strong feelings about it, and I just like can't match that energy. I can't muster that strength of feeling. And Easter for me is always a big challenge because I feel like it's like a day that Christians really want you to get psyched about that doctrine of like resurrection one way or the other. And like, look, I mean, sure, Jesus, he resurrected from the dead. That's great. What a cool guy. I hope I get to resurrect from the dead one day too. Who knows? Like, I'll see when I get there. But I'm just kind of like not that invested in it, which is like a big problem, maybe, for a lot of Christians in particular. And maybe even for me, who could say? But I feel like that might be some good context just to start out in this episode too, to say like, it's interesting anyway to try to take seriously what does the resurrection mean for us. And even when we did a similar episode last year, we were talking about Ea Kyria, and I feel like it was easier because we had just spent so much time on the crucifixion. So I was like, yeah, the resurrection, it's a great political concept, but it's good to maybe think through the theology side of things in this one.
It's true. I mean, historically on this podcast, we've always said that we aren't theologians, but guess what? I've turned over a new leaf. I'm a theologian now, and I'm ready for this conversation.
Whoa, wow, congrats.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't have any university degrees in it. I have no experience really doing it in any sort of capacity, but now I am one now. So there you go.
Congrats. Well, there you have it, folks. There's exactly one theologian on this podcast, and I'm going to go ahead and defer all of that good theology knowledge to you, Matt. We can
thanks.
also...
No, please do. There are 2 seasons of this podcast now. The one where I was not a theologian, and now the one where I am definitely a theologian now.
BT and AT, before theology and after theology. We can also say something really briefly about João Batista Libânio. He is a pretty interesting guy. Matt said a liberation theologian you've probably never heard of, which is true. But if you lived in Brazil, that would probably be a different story. He has been pretty instrumental. He's passed away now, but he was very instrumental in kind of the, like, how would you put it? Like I guess the more institutional operations of liberation theology. Like, he was a liberation theologian, but also very close to the Bishops' Conference in Brazil. He did a lot of kind of practical work in the church. And so, I don't know, he's not like it's not like, Leonardo Boff got silenced for a year and that kind of silenced by the Vatican. And that sort of boosted his international profile, right? And like people wanted to translate his stuff, or maybe there's some other like, liberation theologians who kind of lend to international intrigue in a way that this particular guy, Libânio, doesn't. So it's kind of neat also to just be reading him too, because he did shape a lot of discourse in the church and wrote like a ton of books and, had a really outsized influence in Brazil, but not a person that we talk about very much in the global north. Okay, here's the last table setting piece, then we'll just talk about it. But people probably already know this, but friend of the show, one of our favorite Jesuits in the world, David Inchauskas, has a really cool podcast called the Liberation Theology Podcast. He's been on the show before, but he was working through a bunch of liberation theology texts, I think a long time ago, at the beginning of the podcast that he started, but he has talked about lots of the stuff on there as well. And this book that the essay is found in is called Systematic Theology, and it's like a collection of essays of different perspectives from liberation theologians. And David was like working through that book, so you can listen to an actual person who knows what they're talking about if you want. Talk more about it. I mean, now we have a theologian on this podcast, but
but up until now I haven't been, so you still probably listen to David's podcast.
Right. All right. So the essay is a really fascinating one. Let's just dive into it. It's called Hope, Utopia, and Resurrection, and those are the 3 themes that we're going to talk about as well in the next hour or so. And we'll pull out some stuff we like and maybe try to flag a few things that might be kind of problematic or didn't age well and probably weren't that great when he said them either, but we can parse that out in a minute. But one thing I do really like is the way that he kind of creates a context for his own discourse. So he says this: in 1968, the Latin American bishops met at Medellin in Colombia and proclaimed a new historical epoch for our continent, longing for total emancipation, liberation from all forms of slavery, personal growth, and collective integration. Liberation became the word that galvanized the energies and longings of the whole Latin American continent. It is the great utopia. And given that it arose and grew in Christian territory, it became closely linked with eschatological Christian hope. In the last analysis, it implies faith in the resurrection, so that utopia, hope, and faith in the resurrection are an intimately connected trilogy. So I like this because Libânio is already sort of pointing toward like the material ground out of which his reflection on these concepts kind of grows. And I like too that he's trying to say that, you know, he's going to come at this in kind of an academic or learned way or whatever. But he's trying to articulate that there's a kind of feeling in the continent, right? That liberation is the watchword, and everybody is maybe in a kind of, you know, Christian environment to some degree. And so that puts liberation through these like filters through Christian language and kind of gives them a different flair. And I think that is a really neat way to sort of set the stage for talking about concepts that, I don't know, can be pretty dry and dusty, especially in theology.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, not every single person in Latin America is Catholic or is like dealing with liberation theology for sure.
Or Christian.
But yeah, or Christian in general, right? But I guess I was thinking about this this essay, especially in the context of Penny Lerno's Voice of the People, and just like the background of like how the church was kind of parsing out liberation at the time. I guess it does make sense to say that it's just kind of like it's in the air, right? Like all these Jesuit and other Catholic organizations are like setting up different types of think tanks and organizations to do sociological research with regard to liberation. So I don't know. It makes sense to me, and helpful that this is, you know, a piece of that larger puzzle of things that's happening in Latin America at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of positions him as well in a way that the Boffs, Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, talk about in their book Introducing Liberation Theology, which is a really good book if you needed to read just like one very quick primer on it. In it, they sort of describe the liberation theologian as kind of sort of like an amphibian. Like they have, you know, one part of their life is among the people, and then the other part of their life is sort of trying to do a second order reflection on the experience that they've had with the people. And I feel like you get that here in Libânio's text, right? Like he's sort of pointing to there's something already happening, and he's sort of arriving a little bit late to try to articulate that in a different set of language. So I always like when liberation theologians kind of give you a way to affirm that they're trying to like see themselves as part of the world and not separate from it when they're doing theology.
Yeah. Okay, so you gave us a good place to start. Liberation is sort of the watchword of the Latin American continent. Great. A sweeping statement, but I get it. It's true. Okay. But it has a lot to do with utopia and hope, right? Liberation is a type of utopian idea in the Christian way of thinking. And we'll get to more of what that means in a minute. Though I think it's also worth parsing out, I think at the very beginning, that directly opposed to the idea of, well, okay, this is how Libânio puts it at least, directly opposed to that type of Christian utopia, there is a death of utopia in society, that there's a trend of thinking that he, I think, wrongly characterizes Marxism as, that is anti-utopian, that is trying to think of the world in different terms. So I'm going to read this bit here, and we can kind of talk about what maybe he gets right and gets wrong about this explanation. I think that there's some truth to it, but also some complications, because Marxism, like Christianity, is a really big thing. And just to say something definitive is always going to make somebody upset. So Libânio says, the death of utopia, the end of hope, does not arise from a desperate situation, skepticism, darkening horizons. What it expresses is euphoria. There's no longer any room for utopia or hope, because the era has come to an end in which the objective conditions were lacking to make viable social and historical realities. Then he goes on to say a little bit further down, Marxism has also declared the death of utopia, as it thinks of socialism as the definitive step from utopia to science. Now we no longer need hope, as we can trace the future scientifically. So what Libânio is saying here is he's recognizing that there's a trend in society in the social thinking of the left, right? Especially on the Marxist side of things, that you don't need things like utopia, you don't need ideas like liberation, and you don't need hopes like the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of all people anymore, like those big religious and theological ideas, because we already know what to do. We can already sort of like figure out what we can, how to take the next step from the material reality that already exists, right? And Libânio thinks that this is a problem because Christianity is like fundamentally opposed to that type of thinking because it is utopian. And he also thinks that Marxism, I guess fine enough, but doesn't actually deliver on that promise of that next definitive step from utopia to science. Now, I think that there's something true about this, but there's also, this is like a caricature of what Marxism actually thinks about utopia, and also about like the pathway from socialism on to communism or something, or dialectical thinking, or historical materialism, the whole process, right? Because like I said a minute ago, Marxism is a giant bucket of different people thinking and doing things. And I think that if you I don't know, Marxists love to rail against the idea of utopia because it's, idealistic and, fair enough as far as that goes, I suppose. But at the same time, it's hard for me to even read the Communist Manifesto and not think of it as utopian in the same way that Libânio thinks Christianity is utopian. You know what I mean? Like, it's imagining a world that is better than this one. And that seems pretty utopian to me. Though, it's different, I guess. But there are other Marxists, too, that I think are that have that utopian quality. And I think sometimes it's for the better. So, I don't know. What do you think, Dean?
I think you're right, of course. But I think to add on to that a little bit, too, we'll talk about Libânio's definitions of utopia and hope in a minute, which are kind of loose, but give a little more texture to what we're saying here. And I think we'll see, at least at that time, that I guess I feel like Marxism passes his definitions for those two things. So I find it a bit strange, too. But I feel like, I don't know, like you said, Matt, there's maybe a moment of truth in it. Like, you can find Marxists who are annoying and kind of stale and bureaucratic and so on, but like, it is definitely a caricature of Marxism insofar as, like, Marx did criticize utopian socialists explicitly, including in the Communist Manifesto, but the criticism is that the utopian socialists kind of remain in the utopia. And to me, this feels more like a semantic difference than a substantial difference, by which I mean, like, so Marx uses the word utopia, and he's like, I don't like that. But Libânio gives us this definition of utopia by which it would be hard to read Marx as something other than that, and a lot of Marxists as well. It'd be worth pointing out, too, that, like, so Libânio is writing when there's sort of a new left wave coming over theology, which is to say, like, in the history of left-wing ideas, there's the old left, which is like the communist parties that are associated with the Comintern and the Soviet Union and so on. And then there's a kind of, like, people use different terms, but a dissident Marxist tradition, or a new left tradition that emerges in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s. And like, he opens the essay with by gesturing toward Herbert Marcuse, right? A new left figure. And a lot of new left Marxists are properly Marxist, but they also have a lot of time for things like utopia and hope, kind of famously. So I guess I found it really strange that he would say something as general as this statement, because he's, like, drawing from other Marxists who are, I don't know, clear kind of counterexamples. But all that to say, I feel like probably, this is my completely speculative guess, but probably what's going on here is liberation theology was definitely targeted for being too Marxist. That was like a claim made both in and outside the church to try to dismantle liberation theology. And I think you see a lot of liberation theologians going out of their way to disassociate themselves with Marxism, just to sort of, I don't know, it's just like a label and a problem that they don't need to take on. Like, they've got other stuff going on. So they're like, it's not worth it to me to cozy up to Marxism proper here or whatever. So I'll kind of do my duty and say that I'm not one of those. And here's a kind of ham-fisted critique. You see it sometimes in the Boffs as well. Even Enrique Dussel sometimes pulls that move in different parts of his career. So all that to say, like, I guess I see it as maybe like a politically savvy thing to say, but not an analytically true thing to say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, when I read that first part that I just mentioned, the Death of Utopia stuff, where not being utopian is not like sad, but it's euphoric.
Mm-hmm.
That made me actually think just a lot of like capitalists, though. Totally. I feel like you could definitely switch it around. That capitalists, I guess to me this is like this is Francis Fukuyama. This is like the end of history kind of stuff. That capitalists just like think that liberal democracy is like sort of won out over socialism.
I think he's doing that though, right? Like he's trying to say that there are sort of two sides of the same coin. That like the capitalists on the one side, there's a death of utopia there, because it's this is almost like a sort of critique of postmodernism or something, right? That there's no big story or anything like that. And it's all sort of a symptom of capitalism. And then Marxism too has a death of utopia, but in this other way, like it refuses utopia because it has the scientific answer to revolution. So it's like the euphoria of capitalism on the one hand, the like certitude of materiality on the other, but they're both kind of like edging out those terms. Yeah,
fair enough. Well, okay, let's get to what the definitions of these things are, so maybe we can have even a deeper conversation. We got to get these definitions on the table. It's so important. So he says, Utopia expresses a human aspiration toward a truly just order, a social world that is wholly human, which corresponds fully to the dreams, needs, and deepest aspirations of human life. It is the image of a perfect society which acts as a horizon and a guideline for a real historical project, for the desire of an alternative project to the present situation. And then he goes on to say, Utopia has two fundamental structural elements. It's a criticism of the present situation and a proposal for what should exist. As a criticism, it shows its character of rejection, denunciation, subversion of the existing order. Through its property of having no place, this is something he talks about earlier. The word utopia, is, in a literal translation, means no place. It doesn't exist. Through its property of having no place, it accuses the world of not having permitted it to exist. It points toward what should exist, the right to want, seek, and aspire to another reality. In this case, utopia is anticipatory. I kind of like this definition. Usually when people talk about utopia, they do get weighed down in the it's a very good place, the best place you can imagine where everything is perfect, or the place that cannot exist because it's so perfect, right? That's like the Thomas More thing that people love to talk about. People in political philosophy, they love saying those two definitions. It's like their favorite thing. But I like this because it does kind of give you a better working definition of utopia and how it's not just pie in the sky. It's like a type of criticism that you could levy against the existing order. I do like that. That's pretty cool. And it does make you think of all of the, well, we'll talk about it more in a minute, but there's all these like places in the Bible where you get this type of utopian vision that's subverting the existing order, whether it's the Psalms or different prophetic voices. But I think it does paint utopia as something that's more akin to prophetic speech than just like imagining a really cool city where everyone has a skateboard and can eat a slice of pizza every day or something.
Yeah, I think this is also maybe a good point where we can kind of circle back to the definition by which Marx is a utopian, right? That Marxism also has this sort of negative move. Marx famously says communism is the movement of abolition of all things that exist at the present time. But Marx also has this vision of the future where you can, I forget what it is. It's like you can fish in the morning, you can write a book in the evening, you can, I don't know, you
get a slice of pizza, you get to ride the skateboard. It's great.
Exactly.
You all get a turn on it.
All without being a fisherman, a skateboarder, a pizza eater, right? The idea is that you're not identified with your activity. So all that to say, I mean, it's just kind of picking on him a little bit, but Marx is a utopian by this definition. But I agree. I think it's a really good one, right? There's the negative move. I really like the line of negative because the world doesn't allow it to exist. It doesn't have a space for it. That is really neat. And I think a really cool, I mean, you can sort of see that he's gesturing toward the resurrection here already, which we will come to at the end of the episode. But the idea being that, right, like the resurrection from the dead is this kind of thing that we think the world has no way to permit that to happen. And there's this kind of Christian hope that, like, Utopia, you know, this condition where we've overcome every enemy, including death, like that's the thing that we're going toward, because the world just like won't let that be present right now. I think that's pretty neat.
It is neat. You just said the word hope, so now I have to say the definition of the word hope, according
Right.
to Liviano. Hope is theological because it's directed toward God. It is eschatological, which means, you know, about the end of things, the end times, or the conclusion of the story, right? It is eschatological because it refers to our final end, which is already present in our historical reality in sacramental form as a sign and mediation, but will be unveiled and fulfilled beyond death. Utopia says no to the present and points toward a future within history. Hope says yes to the absolute future, already present, which comes to meet every human being, but is always future in the sense that it is never totally achieved and known. It always keeps its character of being something to come, an unforeseeable surprise, wholly new. Hope reveals the structure of the real as a movement toward this absolute future and not toward emptiness or nothing. I don't know. There's a pretty good like link there to actually that Marx quote that you just mentioned from the German ideology, that communism is the real movement of abolition of the present state of things, right? It doesn't sound so different than hope, actually, if you think about it.
It's true. Maybe, you know, you can kind of crudely map the taxonomy here on a spectrum where you have utopia on the negation side, hope on the affirmation side, right? And I guess whatever Marx is doing is like at times at one side of that spectrum or the other. But I do think it's a good distinction, right? That hope is this thing that is never fulfilled. But there's this weird, like, I had this theology prof in grad school who used to draw these great diagrams, extremely complicated, famously bizarre and awesome diagrams, where he was always talking about hope and time and like trying to, you know, there are all kinds of arrows going in all kinds of directions. And there's some great chaos energy that only a theology professor can give you. But one thing that he used to say, and that I think is said here too, is that hope is really fascinating because it's this thing way in the future, but it like impinges on us as something that's more real than our present. And that's what Libânio is saying here, right? That hope reveals the structure of the real as movement toward this absolute future and not toward emptiness or nothing. So there's this future, you know, state or something that is perfected or whatever, or is real is probably a better word. And it has this arrow pointing backwards to us and like drawing us forward to it. And I think that's pretty neat as well. Utopia is that stance you take of the negation of what's going on, because you're like, dang, there's got to be something better than this. And hope is that sort of posture where you're like, yeah, there is something better, and this is kind of what it looks like.
Yeah, I think so. I don't like mentioning this, but since I'm a theologian, I guess I will mention another theologian. So there's a theologian that is contemporary. His name's Sam Wells, and he's like, I think he taught at Duke. He teaches at Duke. It's impossible for anyone to know and keep track of these things. He wrote a book that I read in my undergrad that I thought was actually really interesting, and it's a book called Improvisation, and it has actually a lot to do with these themes about hope and utopia, though he doesn't use those terms, and his politics aren't good. So there's that for sure, like most theologians, but not me. Anyways, in this book about improvisation, Sam Wells makes the point that that Christians, they already know the end of the story, right? And they already have like this script for how the story goes. You know that Jesus died and was resurrected, and like through Jesus all things are sort of like reconciled, and that's really interesting, right? And because we know that to be the case, we have to like improvise our way through the rest of the world until until like the promissory note of hope is like cashed in or something. Maybe not the right metaphor, but there's something to that, for better and for worse, I think. Again, his book is more complicated than this, and like I said, some things that I don't like about it, but the idea that like what's like the end of the story, so in the meantime you have to like act in this particular way that makes it clear that the end, that you're like that you're in on how the story ends. That's something to do with hope.
Yeah, I agree. And the more we're talking about it, the more I'm kind of remembering also why I'm so reticent to talk about theology, because
yeah,
man, hope, it's great. Great if you can get it. But it is very hard to get. Knowing the end of the story, feeling very confident about that, is something that I just am not.
No, it's tough. It's worth saying that though too, because so this essay, I think through and through, gives you this feeling that like, well, because Jesus was resurrected, like you should feel like empowered by that, right? That you have hope that things will turn out in this particular way, that things will be reconciled to one another, that justice will be done, that this like other world is possible, and so on. But politically speaking, it's a really hard thing to like believe, because of how hopeless situations often are, and how utopian ideas can be warped so easily to become bad, which Liviano has something to say about that as well. But it's worth bringing that up, that there is like, to me, like a difficulty in thinking this through in a really serious way, because maybe I mean, it's the challenge of theology, and maybe the challenge of being a person of faith in general. But sometimes having hope is very difficult, I guess is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I always think of that quote from Kafka by way of Walter Benjamin, that there's an infinite amount of hope, but not for us. Like, yeah, lots of hope, just like probably for someone else, though, right? It's easier to kind of have that posture, but Easter is the one time of year that I do try to like make hope a discipline in my life. And, for one day, I guess, I'll give that a shot. I feel like more of a Good Friday Christian in general. Christmas, if I'm feeling good. Easter doesn't really do it for me. But, like that is the challenge of the Christian message in a kind of fundamental ways. Like there's some kind of hope involved, and in ways that I think are also liabilities, right? Like, some people are really triumphalistic about that, I think.
Yeah.
Especially a certain brand of Christian. And I think that is tough. I mean, we should feel like I said, hope is great if you can get it. And I would never want to take that away from anybody or say that like being hopeful is naive. I think that is a foolish thing that leftists who read too much critical theory or whatever think that they are, I don't know, smarter than average people because they're like unhappy enough or something like that.
Well, because on the left, you equate knowledge with being unhappy.
Yeah, exactly.
That when you know something, you are miserable because of it.
Exactly, which is bad. I think that is also like a fundamental victory of capitalism over our brains. But so maybe there's something there that like theology could be some sort of resistance to that state of being, just insofar as it's trying to be like, well, we could sort of hope our way not out of capitalism or something, but out of that kind of mind prison or whatever. But we have to do it in ways knowing that, like, there are a bunch of asterisks that come along with that, I think.
Yeah, it's worth, I think, disentangling, too, the idea of hope from optimism, because I think they're different things.
Yeah.
Like, optimism is like the general feeling that things will just kind of like work out in one way or another and like it's going to be okay. But hope, I think there is a sense of like struggle involved in it. And that to me seems like a pretty big difference. Hope is, you're not gonna just like let things fall where they may and you think that those be okay. But hope is like striving for something and hoping that it works out.
Mm-hmm.
Like struggling in a direction and because you're a Christian, the end of the story that it's gonna work out. Even if you don't think it really will, you gotta hope. You gotta hold on to it, right?
It's true. You know, ironically, I think that's actually why a certain amount of Marxism maybe helps me maintain a certain type of hope in ways that are kind of contrary to what Libânio says earlier. But like, it's something about the combination of a Christian hope that says, yeah, like I think there's some God of love out there who's, you know, trying his best, and so are we, and hopefully we can all sort it out in some metaphysical way. But I think also what Marx gives you is a way of like putting some particularities to that, right? That like, well, what do we actually want? Like, we want a society that isn't run by capitalist exploitation. We want a society where there's equitable production relationships and distribution of goods and so on and so forth. And I feel like that helps me feel like hope is not just optimism, but has like some, you know, some like real contours to it. Like maybe not quite a blueprint, but you know, Cuba's like down there doing a bunch of stuff and like they're trying to figure it out under rough conditions. And like that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah. I don't want to belabor the point any longer than we have to, but this is a podcast and I will indulge my basest desire to talk about something. That's okay, I guess.
I mean, Lent is almost over, so you might as well.
Yeah. So there's this, you know, on Twitter, there are types of guys.
I do.
There's a guy for everything on Twitter. And there's a guy I really don't like on Twitter, and I don't like this guy because I think in a lot of ways I've been this guy, and I'm recognizing what I don't like about myself. But there's a guy on Twitter that's like a not surprised guy, who whenever something bad happens, they're like, yeah, I'm not surprised about that. Of course, it's the worst thing that possibly could have happened. I'm not surprised because I have no expectations about the world or whatever. And I don't like that guy because it is like hoping for something better would mean that you're like stupid, like you're an idiot if you think that like things could possibly work out. But also there's in being a not surprised guy, there's also a type of anti-intellectualism where you're not really willing to learn about like what's actually happening or the struggle that's like at stake because like, you know, it'll just turn out bad in the end anyways. And to me, there seems like, you know, to kind of transition from being a not surprised guy to be a hope guy, there does have to be sort of like a change in your comportment in the world, like how you act in the world, and maybe like what you see as something that is actually hopeful. Here are maybe two examples. One is a very esoteric one for the podcast, and one is maybe like a more understandable thing. But the Ernesto Cardenal poem, The Mystical Letters of the FSLN, is, we reference it all the time in this podcast, but I think it is a great example of like how hope might actually work, where like, you know, you are you're down about, you know, capitalism, the whole society, but then you look and see that like you've actually accomplished something that is liberative, and then God smacks you across the face and says, look, you idiot, you've done, this is what I did for you, and like maybe you should think about that. But also I think I think that's maybe one way hope works, right? That you just kind of have to change the way that you think about how your like justice works in the world, and maybe how other people have, including yourself, have like already kind of participated in that. That's a hopeful thing for sure. But I mean, and just looking at like the types of the things that people do like to express hope and express a type of utopia despite all of the awful things in the world, despite all of the not surprised guys. Like, for example, there was a big strike of service workers in the South this past week. There were 3 cities who struck a bunch of workers, and they all got together and they talked about having safe jobs and how important that was. And like, on the one hand, you could be a not surprised guy, and you could be like, well, of course service work is bad. It's always bad. It's the worst. Capitalist exploitation is awful. And, you know, these people, is, you know, they're never going to get anything better because this is just capitalism. But then like the hopeful part is to actually think like these people literally walked off their job to go do this for a day instead, right? They thought whatever this other world they can imagine, one where they actually have a say on their job, is so important. They did not show up for work, and that they're going to take whatever repercussions come to them. And that's extremely hopeful, I guess. But you don't recognize it as such, and unless you're willing to see that there is an end to the story that is possibly different than being a not surprised guy. Yeah. Oh boy.
I completely agree. I wrote my master's thesis on this guy named Peter Sloterdijk, who I find hard to recommend. I don't recommend him. But I will recommend this point that he makes that I think is very right, and why I wrote a whole thesis about it, because I think it's important. He wrote this book called Critique of Cynical Reason. And he was really mad about critical theorists in Germany who basically did exactly what we're talking about, who equated more knowledge with being more bummed out, more depressed. And he has this pretty important line where he says, he talks about what he calls enlightened false consciousness. So in Marxism, ideology is always false consciousness, right? It's like you have these ideas that are wrong, and that's bad. But the paradox is like having an enlightened false consciousness should be a contradiction in terms, because if you're enlightened, if you know what's going on, then like your consciousness should be true, right? Not false. But instead it makes us cynical. It's like, I know everything that's going on and therefore I know that it's bad, but I basically don't have any way of changing it or any like feeling that it could be changed. And so therefore you kind of like resign yourself to being like knowing better is basically the same thing as having the power to have changed it. And that is also ideological. Like, it's like not true, you know, it's fake. And I think Sloterdijk doesn't know how to get you out of it. But, you know, liberation theology kind of does. Like, it's like, well, if you got together with a bunch of other poor people or working people or whatever, and you figured out what to do, like, there are paths available to you, even though everything is, you know, like, not in good shape or whatever. And people are changing it. So all this to say, cynicism, it's not cool anymore. It was cool when Barack Obama was the president, but it's not cool now, and we got to do something different.
That's cool. That's true. In the more enlightened times of Joe Biden, we can't be cynics anymore. Dean, I feel like we've strayed so far from what this podcast is about. Can you get us back on track?
All right, yeah. All right, we're talking about, we only have like 20 minutes left, man. We're just gabbing away out here. Utopia and hope, we've got these definitions on the table, but let's skip ahead a little bit. So Libânio, he's a real theologian, he's a Jesuit priest, and he has a lot to say about finding utopia and hope in the Bible. It's kind of interesting, but you already know what he has to say. Basically, he says that there's this kind of like story in the Bible where God is giving the people of God, whether Israel or folks in the New Testament, God is giving them this kind of posture of difference toward the world, right? They're not like doing the same things as their neighbors, or at least they're not supposed to be. And also God has this sort of promise, this relationship of promise that things will be better. So he's trying to root these concepts in a biblical way of doing things, which I think is pretty interesting. But one of the most interesting things, I think, that kind of pulls this together is actually something he has to say about utopia more generally. He says, for a people left on the margin of history, or rather living on the underside of history, it is a historical force for liberation, talking about utopia. It rejects the defeatism and fatalism generated and nourished by the dominant ideology, and is an anticipation of the future as a different, possible, longed-for reality. It keeps alive the conviction that present reality can be changed, that it's not a natural order imposed by God, but the result of interested human decisions. Utopia is a mysticism inspiring action for change. Utopia impels to action, opening new spaces which previously appeared to be closed off. And I like reading that alongside all these biblical examples because this is what God is like trying to do in the Bible over and over, Libânio says. He's trying to sort of give this sense that like there are new spaces being opened up that seemed closed off. There's this kind of compelling action to change. And there's this real sense that for Libânio, theology cashes itself out in history. Like, even though utopia is sort of out there, right? It's the negative move, or hope is out there. It's the affirmation of promise in the future. Both of them have to, like, deal with history. And they have to materialize in history, even if not, like, absolutely. And I think that is a pretty important contribution for Christians on the left, right? That, like, the Bible is sort of testifying to that constant, like, opening of space in time that you get through utopia and hope.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. It's a interesting way to think about the Bible, not one that I actually had considered. But, you know, it makes me think of all of the prophets letting justice fall down like a waterfall, like a river, right? that's a utopian vision that is this type of like um well, like Libanya says, mysticism. I love it. It's a really cool and I think powerful idea.
Yeah. There's a bunch of stuff that we could have gone into a little more critically here, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to sort of wrongly maybe blow over it and trust you, the listener. If you want to read this essay and find out for yourself, you can figure it out, I guess.
I mean, you're hoping that, right? And that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. I will flag one thing, though. There's some, like, real Christian, I don't know, like, Christian supremacy stuff going on in this essay that is maybe, like, to be expected from a real Christian person, a priest talking, but also is an unforced error, like not necessary to Christianity. For example, there's some supersessionism in here, I think, that tries to sort of dismiss Judaism and the Israel of the past in a bad way. It doesn't like come out and say that right, on the face of it, but that is what's happening for sure. So don't like that, but something that, like I said, I think is pretty obvious if you just read the text. But to stick with some of the good parts, not that they excuse the bad parts, but, just trying to keep it one tone on this podcast. There's I think another interesting piece here about Utopia that I want to pull out, where Libânio says, God's kingdom is not a utopia because its fulfillment will be the victory over sin and death. If historically it generated utopias with a purely earthly character, it nevertheless remains the critical standard for all utopias, including those of the Church itself, which is its sacrament. This reality is clarified theologically by the resurrection of Jesus. We made it. In this eschatological event, Jesus' body as a unique and personal center of decision, as the representative of history and the cosmos, achieves the definitive quality of life which forever surpasses time and the confinement of space. With him, the cosmos and history become ripe for God's eternity. The resurrection is not a terminus, it is not utopia. It is not to be found in any of the utopias, which are simply the creations of human imagination, aspiration, and desire. The resurrection is the place, the topia of theological hope. And then he closes off saying, through the resurrection of the dead, which is God's fundamental act of love, the eschatological significance of God's preference for the poor appears more clearly. Those who suffered so greatly in earthly history, who were familiar with weakness and humiliation, now share in the victory, power, and glory of God, who raised Jesus and who will raise these poor of the earth. So, Matt, you yourself are a theologian. And I'm going to ask you to comment on this great lyrical presentation of a firm belief in the bodily resurrection and what it sort of does for utopias. How does it strike you, Matt, the theologian of this podcast?
Yeah, I'm having some second thoughts about being a theologian right now. I'm not so sure about this anymore. That's okay. So something that I think is interesting about this is, I'll get to the bodily resurrection part in a minute, but Libânio thinks that utopias, like, they're a mystical thing, right? And it's a type of thinking. We said it's a type of critique as well. But also Libânio is like pretty open that he thinks it's a type of practice as well, that like people actively put utopian ideas into action in all kinds of ways, right? And I think that, which is good, right? That it's not just like a place that doesn't exist or a nice idea that you have in your head, but it's something that you can actually try. Which I think means that things like base communities are utopian. That's great. But also in terms of like the bodily resurrection of Jesus, I think about the most utopian thing that comes to mind is like the Church of Acts. And that's a utopian action in practice, right? People are living, they're living a different way altogether. They're not working. They're sharing things. There's the communism of consumption that we've talked about so many times in this podcast, and they're doing that specifically because they've experienced something, pretty mind blowing, pretty different, pretty outside of the norm for them. They've seen the fundamental act of love, and they've decided to live completely differently because of it. And I think that there's something to that, and in Christian communities, is often will put some of these utopian ideas into practice, and sometimes they do it very poorly. But I still think it is like a hopeful thing that people find something really important about Jesus as like a person who exists, and also a person who, like, we might recognize as like Ignacio the Curious, puts it, as like a crucified class of people, right? That we find Jesus in that class of people, and that we find those ideas and like those actions and like sort of way of being in the world so powerful that people start to live their lives differently. That's pretty hopeful in and of itself, I think.
Yeah, you sound like a great theologian to me.
Yeah, I'm not really saying much, is kind of what I'm doing, which I think is pretty theological.
That's how you get an MDiv. I think you could be a great pastor. No shade to those of you listeners who do have MDivs. You're all brilliant and
You're all
saying
great.
things of great substance.
Of course, but not me, though, is what I'm trying to say.
That's how Matt gets an MDiv, is what I'm saying. Yeah, I think, too, there's something interesting also about the kingdom of God being this thing that is something that generates utopias, but is also critical of all utopias.
Yeah.
That it's like, it's out there. It's this thing that you can like put your hope in or whatever. And it has this interesting recursive effect. Like, the kingdom of God is, it's with you, it's among you, but it's also like not here yet. There's something really interesting about that I think is going on here, and the way that gets sort of balled up into the resurrection as well is really interesting. I think like I said at the beginning of the podcast, whenever I hear people talk about the resurrection, or I'm kind of expected to be interested in it, like around Easter, I just sort of, I don't know, I find it hard to get fired up about it. Like when on Twitter, for example, on Easter, there's going to be, my feed is just going to be 1,000 people saying he's risen indeed. I feel like I'm just going to like close the app and wait till Monday. There's nothing wrong with saying it. Like, I don't know why it bugs me. It just does. And like for no good reason. Like, I don't think it's bad or anything. I guess it's just like, there's some part of me that feels icked by it. And I feel like this way of putting it, though, allows me a way to sort of entertain that doctrine in a way that makes it feels like there are stakes involved. Like the resurrection of Jesus's body can like generate a historical sort of manifestation that might be like unique or important or interesting, and like historically has also generated manifestations of earthly life that are not very good, right? Like lots of colonialists believed in the resurrection of the dead and so on. But I think there is this sense that you can like tie that doctrine to something historical, and that, at least for me, is always the way to get me to care about a doctrine. If you can be like, listen, if you think about this doctrine and you make it real in your life, it will like help you be better at, I don't know, appreciating historical revolution. It's like, okay, then I'm sold. I will listen. So I'm going to be reflecting on that, I think, at Easter time.
Yeah. There's a part earlier in this essay where Libânio talks about like the sort of bad types of utopia, the types that are like conservative or are done at the expense of like human flourishing and freedom and stuff. And right after that, like disclaimer about the pitfalls of utopia, he does talk about how liberation theology is, because it kind of takes on this this option for the poor. It kind of skirts a lot of those problems, because the people that are coming to liberation theology and they're practicing this type of utopian thinking, because of their social position, they've just fundamentally like don't fall into those categories. And I think that's kind of interesting, though, because when we're talking about like Jesus' resurrection as a generative event, it's like what types of, and especially when you view it through the framework of liberation, like what types of utopian ideas is that giving you, right? Like what ideas is that pointing toward? And to me, I mean, the thing that makes me excited about resurrection is like, it's a world where the crucified people they're not crucified. That's the cool thing about Jesus' resurrection, is that that there's like a promissory note that things will be right in the end, and people won't be exploited or crucified. They won't be fired for speaking out at their job. They won't go hungry because they don't have food. There won't be billionaires who are like forcing people to live extremely torturous lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's cool. I like that.
That's
a
something
cool
that,
theological idea.
It is. Libânio closes his essay even talking that way, right? He says, the last word on history has already been said. No human power, no dictator, no ruling power will decide the final destiny of the poor. God's love raised Jesus and will raise all those he loves and who love him. And among these, the poor have first place. And I can get behind that. The idea of Jesus' resurrection being that promissory note that, the crucifying powers of the world think that they can bury the poor, think that they can bury the rabble-rousers and so on. But in the end, those are the people that God chooses to be like, actually, these are the people who will inherit the earth. I think that's a good metaphysical promissory note I can get behind.
Yeah. They're the people that God chose to inherit the earth, and they're the people who keep standing up over and over again, right? I mean, that's great. That's what I think like hope and utopia in action look like is people like that not sitting down and just like letting it kind of happen, right? Not being complacent or optimistic, but striving for justice. And I don't know. It's a hard idea, but one I think is good to practice.
I agree. Well, there you have it, folks. Happy Easter. Lent is over. We did it. We made it. You can eat your chocolate. You can say hallelujah finally. You can put those Lenten things away and get your great big bunny out here, paint those eggs, open those eggs, find those jelly beans, and somehow all that, when you are on your big Easter egg hunt, you can take some time to think about how God's kingdom calls all earthly utopias into question. I think it's going to slow you down a little bit. Some of the other kids are going to get a few more eggs than you as a result, but you're going to come away with a deeper revolutionary consciousness, and that is the most important thing.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us there at, I think, $2 or more, you get access to our cool Behind the Paywall Discord and also our cool Behind the Paywall podcast called the Magnificast Lock-In, where we get goofy and we talk about Reddit questions from the Christianity subreddit, and also we talk about current events. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have